Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Imagine being the head of the entire United States intelligence apparatus. Like, you oversee 18 different agencies, you have access to the nation's most guarded secrets, and theoretically, you are the ultimate authority on national security threats.
Right. It's a massive amount of power.
It is. Yet behind closed doors, your own colleagues joke that your job title actually stands for "Do Not Invite."
Which is just wild to even think about.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. It is Saturday, May 23, 2026, and breaking news has literally just hit Washington. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, is resigning.
And when a cabinet official of that magnitude steps down, you're rarely just looking at one story. You're really looking at a split screen.
Yeah.
On one side, you have the official narrative, and on the other, the background context operating on a completely parallel track.
Exactly. So our mission today is to build a chronological timeline of the events leading up to this sudden Friday announcement. We're going to put that split screen together for you.
And we've pulled from a deeply diverse stack of sources for this, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at breaking cable news bulletins from Fox News, progressive commentary from outlets like the Young Turks, investigative reports from Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. We are even parsing Gabbard's own recent public speeches.
Because we really want to compare the official, intensely personal reasons given for her departure against these swirling external reports of massive systemic tension within the administration.
Right. And to understand the reality of this resignation, we have to weigh the public stances against the private mechanics of Washington. We are committing to looking at all of these claims impartially, to figure out how someone goes from holding one of the most powerful positions in the world to suddenly submitting their resignation on a Friday afternoon.
So let's start with the facts exactly as they were handed to the press.
Okay, so on Friday, Gabbard met with President Trump in the Oval Office to formally submit her resignation, and her official departure date is set for June 30th.
Right. And the primary reason given is just absolutely devastating. It's a severe family medical crisis.
Yeah. Her husband, Abraham, has been diagnosed with an aggressive form of bone cancer.
And the sources detail that he is also dealing with severe lung cancer pain. I mean, it is an incredibly grim diagnosis.
It really is heartbreaking.
In her resignation letter, she made it unequivocally clear that he has been her rock throughout her entire career, and she simply must step away to be by his side and fully support him through this battle.
Which is, that's a completely undisputed, universally understood reason to step down. Managing the national security apparatus is basically like trying to assemble a massive jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are actively lying to you.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. And trying to do that while facing your spouse's aggressive cancer diagnosis is just an impossible balancing act for anyone.
Totally. But notice the specific timeline of the exit, though. She didn't resign effectively immediately.
Right. She gave notice until June 30th.
Which is a little over a month away, and that is a highly calculated move. From a national security standpoint, that buffer allows for a secure transition.
So things don't just fall apart overnight.
Exactly. Fox News sources noted her office had actually just completed a highly significant threat assessment on China and Asia. So she is essentially leaving with a major piece of intelligence architecture locked in.
Giving the administration the runway to find a replacement without dropping any critical national security plates.
Right.
So if you only look at that side of the split screen, the story makes total sense. A dedicated public servant is stepping away for a deeply personal family tragedy.
Yeah.
But to understand the friction that surrounded her tenure, we really have to look at the other side of that screen. Our sources indicate that Gabbard's position as DNI was already structurally fractured long before this diagnosis.
Yeah, we have to rewind the clock to the beginning of the year and track the ideological cracks. And to map those cracks, you first have to look at her political baseline.
Which was very different from the current administration, right?
Completely. Back in 2019 and 2020, Gabbard built a massive portion of her public brand on being fiercely anti-war. I mean, she was photographed wearing shirts that literally said, "No war with Iran."
Wow, literally on a shirt.
Yes. And she routinely called to get troops out of Iraq and Syria and aggressively tweeted that the U.S. needs to stay out of Venezuela. She argued the Venezuelan people should determine their own future without American intervention.
Okay, but then we hit January 2026, and the administration is actively planning to oust Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela.
Right.
And according to progressive commentators and various reports, the White House completely excluded Gabbard from months of those planning meetings. You have to wonder how that actually works in practice. Like, how does a president physically and bureaucratically cut the nation's top intelligence officer out of military planning?
It mostly comes down to the mechanics of compartmentalization.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, even at the highest levels of government, access is dictated by a need-to-know basis. This is often organized through special access programs or specific National Security Council working groups.
So they just don't invite her to the specific groups.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
If the White House restricts the distribution list for the readouts of those Venezuela strategy sessions, the DNI simply doesn't get the briefing. The National Security Advisor or the Pentagon can essentially run a parallel planning process.
Which leads to those open secrets we mentioned. It was so well known that White House aides were allegedly joking that DNI actually stood for do not invite.
Yeah, and when your own executive branch colleagues are making acronym jokes about your exclusion from foreign policy, the structural dysfunction is basically fatal.
And the exclusion didn't just stop in South America, right?
No, not at all. By February 2026, the Wall Street Journal reported she was similarly sidelined from conversations about the conflict with Iran before it even began.
Which creates a massive paradox in governance. I mean, the Director of National Intelligence was a role created after 9/11 specifically to fuse all intelligence together.
Right, so the president has one clear, objective picture.
Exactly. But if you are the DNI and your prior ideological stances are so heavily at odds with the current administration's goals that you are being cut out of the actual military planning.
You aren't directing national intelligence.
Right. You're just occupying a seat that has been entirely disconnected from the steering wheel.
And that disconnection is exactly what the sources are highlighting. Because when a DNI is cut out of the administration's private war planning, that friction doesn't stay hidden in West Wing whispers forever.
No, it eventually fractures in public, and that public breaking point happened during a congressional hearing. Let's move the timeline to March 2026.
Okay.
Gabbard is testifying in front of Congress for a worldwide threats hearing. And during this testimony, she states that as a result of something called Operation Midnight Hammer, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated.
She told Congress the underground facilities were bombed, buried, and shuttered with cement, and there was no effort to rebuild.
Right, and that is a highly definitive declarative intelligence assessment. But then the hearing immediately takes a sharp, controversial turn.
What happened?
A senator asks her a direct follow-up question based on her own assessment. They ask, given this obliteration, is it the intelligence community's assessment that Iran poses an imminent nuclear threat?
Which is a simple yes or no question based on the data she just provided.
Exactly. But her response was baffling. She flatly refused to answer. She argued that it is not the intelligence community's responsibility to determine what is or isn't an imminent threat, claiming that only the president can make that determination.
That is highly unusual.
I really have to push back on her logic here. That sounds exactly like a mechanic looking at your car, seeing that the brake lines are completely severed, and when you ask, is it safe to drive, the mechanic says only the driver can decide if it's safe to drive.
That is a perfect analogy.
Like, gathering the data and assessing the reality of that threat is literally her job description.
It is. The mechanic analogy perfectly illustrates why her answer broke protocol. The entire purpose of the intelligence community is to provide an objective assessment of reality, independent of political policy.
Right, the president decides what to do about the threat.
Exactly, but the DNI is supposed to clearly state whether the threat exists. The commentators and our sources argue this moment showcased a DNI trying to navigate pure political loyalty, like she was deferring entirely to the president's public stance rather than delivering an independent intelligence assessment to Congress.
It really felt like a massive pivot away from traditional intelligence duties, and we see that pivot in her other actions around this time too, engaging in activities way outside the traditional scope of a DNI.
Like what?
Yeah, for example, she showed up at the Fulton County Election Center to investigate election integrity. She also made public claims accusing the Obama administration of pushing the Russiagate story, despite reportedly knowing in her official capacity that there was no Russian interference.
From an analytical standpoint, those extracurricular activities really reinforce the narrative of a sidelined official. Well, the commentators in our sources speculated that because she was being frozen out of the major foreign policy planning, like the Venezuela and Iran conflicts, she may have been actively searching for relevance in domestic, partisan issues that fall completely outside the national security mandate.
So the foreign policy portfolio is shrinking. The congressional hearings are exposing a bizarre deference to the White House over objective analysis, and she's spending time investigating county election centers.
Yeah, the lot.
But here is where the story gets genuinely surreal. Just before her resignation announcement, an unprecedented domestic intelligence dispute erupts right inside her own office.
Yes, the document drama. This is the moment the internal tension reaches an absolute boiling point, revealing a mass breakdown in the chain of command.
Okay, so Republican Representative Anna Paulina Luna goes on the news and makes an explosive claim. She states that the CIA raided Gabbard's ODNI office.
And before we get into the details, let's just clarify that ODNI stands for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. That is Gabbard's literal headquarters.
Right. And this claim stems from a whistleblower named James Erdman III.
Erdman is a former CIA employee and the co-founder of a group called Fids for Freedom. His background is crucial here because it explains his access to this kind of internal bureaucratic warfare.
Because he still has contacts on the inside.
Exactly. As a former insider with a network of government whistleblowers, he claimed that the CIA removed 40 boxes of highly classified historical files directly from Gabbard's workspace.
And these weren't just any files. Specifically, these were documents regarding the JFK assassination and MKUltra.
MKUltra being the CIA's highly controversial historical mind control experiment program.
Right. And according to the reports, President Trump had ordered the full declassification and release of these remaining files. So Gabbard, acting as the DNI, was in the process of reviewing them for that exact release.
But then the press secretary for the ODNI immediately puts out a statement explicitly denying that a raid occurred.
Right. But Representative Luna quickly clarifies her phrasing. She says, okay, it wasn't a tactical raid, nobody kicked down the doors with weapons drawn, but the fact remains that the CIA did indeed go into the office and take the documents back.
Which is just absurd.
It is! The CIA essentially walked into their boss's office and repossessed their own historical mind control files to stop them from being declassified.
You really have to look at the mechanics of how that is even systematically possible. Like, how does a subordinate agency physically and legally bypass its boss?
Yeah, how does that happen?
It comes down to bureaucratic loopholes regarding something called originating authority.
Okay.
Even though the DNI oversees all intelligence, the CIA is the agency that originally created the MKUltra files, so they can invoke strict chain of custody protocols, or claim the files contain unredacted sources and methods that only the originating agency has the statutory authority to protect.
Oh, wow. So they basically use a technicality to legally march in and pack up the boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But let's strip away the sensationalism of the word raid for a second. The core fact being alleged here, that an intelligence agency bypassed the Director of National Intelligence to secure documents the president ordered declassified. It shows a complete systemic breakdown of trust.
Oh, totally.
The commentators following this were deeply alarmed. They suggested it paints a picture of a CIA that is out of control and actively fighting transparency efforts mandated by the administration. They are essentially treating the DNI as an adversary rather than a boss.
It's the ultimate bureaucratic turf war, and it's happening right as the walls are closing in on her tenure. I mean, with wars escalating that she historically opposed, White House aides mocking her, and the CIA allegedly bypassing her authority on her own desk, we finally arrive at May 17th, 2026.
Which is just days before that Friday Oval Office meeting.
Exactly. So on May 17th, Gabbard gave a speech on the National Mall. And the context of this event is vital. It was marking exactly 250 years since the Second Continental Congress called for a day of humility, fasting, and prayer in 1776, just before declaring independence.
And if you read the transcript of this speech, it is really stunning. It wasn't a standard political stump speech projecting strength or outlining policy.
Not at all. It was intensely spiritual. She talked about how leaders in this world often have their eyes covered by pride, born out of relative power or fame.
She emphasized that humans are tiny, our time on this planet is extremely short, and we shouldn't see ourselves as the ultimate controllers of the universe.
Yeah, and she literally asked for God's guidance to light the path so the country can successfully navigate the troubled waters that we are in. She also spoke about the necessity of being willing to forgive those who have offended us.
The specific language she chose is deeply revealing of her mindset at that exact moment in the timeline.
Right, because it does not sound like a leader securely in power. It sounds exactly like someone looking for an exit. Someone acknowledging they are caught in a massive storm and just making peace with the fact that they are stepping away.
That speech provides a beautiful synthesis of the two parallel tracks we've been investigating.
The split screen we talked about?
Yes. The troubled waters she mentioned likely carry a heavy dual meaning. On one hand, it absolutely refers to her husband's tragic health battle.
Which is a profoundly troubled water for any family to navigate.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, knowing what we know now, it almost certainly references the insurmountable political pressure and isolation she faced internally.
Because right around the time of this speech, Reuters publishes a report citing a source familiar with the matter, claiming that Gabbard was actually forced out by the White House.
And the White House hasn't commented on that.
No, but it perfectly feeds into this dual narrative.
Right. While the family crisis is the official, publicly stated, and completely valid reason for leaving, the Reuters report of being forced out aligns seamlessly with the structural timeline we just built.
Right.
A DNI who was systematically excluded from war planning, mocked by aides, clashing with the basic premise of intelligence gathering in Congress, and having documents repossessed by the CIA, had arguably already lost her seat at the table long before Friday's resignation.
Which has naturally led to a massive wave of speculation from progressive commentators. Outlets like the Young Turks highlight a big question hanging over this exit.
What's the question?
Is she leaving because a new, more aggressive phase of the war with Iran is imminent and she wants absolutely no part of it?
Oh, because remember, her original brand was distinctly anti-war.
Exactly. The commentators wonder if this resignation is the start of a redemption arc. Like, will she wait out her June 30th transition period and then loudly speak out against the administration's foreign policy? Or will she just quietly fade away into private life, using the family medical crisis as a shield from having to address the glaring political contradictions of her tenure?
It's a fair question. And the commentators noted a specific standard they are holding her to. They argue that if she truly opposed the administration's actions in Venezuela and Iran, she should have spoken up while holding the office, rather than serving as the DNI during the escalation.
Right, taking a stand when it mattered most.
Yeah. They say if she speaks out now, or immediately after she leaves, they might grant her some political grace. But if she waits until the next election cycle to reveal she was secretly anti-war the whole time, they argue that doesn't count for much.
That makes sense.
Ultimately, though, with the severity of her husband's diagnosis, she may simply choose to focus entirely on her family, which is a choice anyone would understand.
Absolutely. So bringing this all together for you listening, we started this deep dive looking at a split screen.
We did.
On one side, we tracked a deeply personal, undeniably tragic family medical crisis that offers a graceful, entirely necessary exit for a public servant. But running right alongside it, on the exact same screen, we unpack the mechanics of a severe institutional breakdown.
Yeah.
We saw how a director of national intelligence can be systematically excluded from war planning in Venezuela and Iran, how that isolation leads to baffling congressional testimony, and the bureaucratic loopholes that allow unprecedented intelligence community infighting over historical CIA documents.
It is a stark reminder that in Washington, the stated reason for an action and the environmental pressures surrounding that action are rarely mutually exclusive. They usually exist together, feeding off each other.
Very true.
But looking at the entirety of this timeline, it raises an incredibly important question that goes far beyond just one person's career.
What is that?
Well, if a sitting director of national intelligence, the person theoretically at the very top of the post-9/11 intelligence pyramid, can be completely frozen out of military planning via classification loopholes, openly mocked by White House aides, and have classified documents literally removed from their office by subordinate agencies.
Wow, yeah, when you put it like that.
All right, what does that actually mean for the real power and the fundamental purpose of the DNI role moving forward?
Is the person in that chair actually driving a car, or are they just a passenger locked in the back seat watching the road go by?
It's a fascinating question, and one you should definitely keep in mind as this administration searches for her replacement. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.